Last October, inside a high-floor conference room in Jeongeuk, South Korea, Mayor Lee Hok-soo sat across from a group of stone-faced executives.
A difficult conversation, I imagine.
He wasn't there to discuss typical city business. He was there to plead. He looked at the leaders of SK Nexelis, the world's largest copper foil producer, and asked them, quite simply, to save the city's future.
Wow.
It was a scene of just quiet desperation. This single factory consumes a staggering 50% of the entire city's electricity.
50%? That's unbelievable.
It provides the only major source of employment for hundreds of families. But as the mayor spoke about protecting the backbone of the industry, the executives, they just remained silent.
Because they were looking at the numbers.
Their eyes were fixed on a different set of numbers.
Oh.
A monthly electricity bill that had just surpassed 5 billion won. That's roughly $3.8 million.
Every single month.
Every month. In the world of high-tech copper foil, electricity isn't just a utility, it's the primary raw material.
It's an ingredient.
Exactly. To stretch copper into sheets 130th the thickness of a human hair, you need massive high-voltage currents running 24 hours a day without a single second of fluctuation.
Constant, stable, and very expensive power.
But with power prices surging, the cost of simply keeping the machines humming now accounts for nearly a third of their total production cost.
A third of the entire cost, just on electricity.
What's truly striking isn't just the price, but a bizarre reversal in economic logic. For decades, the global standard was clear. Keep industrial power cheap to ensure your factories can compete.
Right. It was the foundation of the whole model.
Yet, in a strange twist of policy, it is now officially more expensive to power a massive South Korean factory than it is to light a citizen's home.
The complete opposite of what you expect.
That afternoon in Jeongeuk, the mayor received the answer he feared. Despite his pleas, the equipment wasn't staying. The machines were already being prepped for shipment to Uzbekistan, where power is a fraction of the cost.
A survival decision.
This isn't just one company moving. It is the beginning of a silent, high-voltage exodus that is leaving the miracle on the Han River in the dark.
And that opening anecdote, it just captures the entire narrative perfectly for this deep dive. Our mission is to understand how this single fundamental policy change, the inversion of electricity tariffs, is creating this high voltage exodus of South Korea's strategic industries.
Right. We're going to get into the math, but also the consequences.
We are. We're going to look into the numbers behind this inverted pricing, assess the critical damage to global competitiveness, and ultimately trace the long-term threat this poses to the nation's supply chain sovereignty.
It's a compelling story where a political calculation seems to be actively overriding decades of established national industrial policy.
Forcing strategic assets offshore. It's a huge deal.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core problem here feels like something out of a textbook on economic paradox. For generations, South Korea's ascent as a manufacturing powerhouse rested on predictable, affordable electricity. Industrial power rates were the foundation, historically kept below 100,000 won. It's about, $72 per megawatt hour. This was the unspoken contract with manufacturers.
It was the bedrock of their competitiveness. That stability allowed huge companies, the chaebol and their thousands of suppliers, to model complex supply chains with a predictable energy variable.
But the last 3 years, specifically from 2022 to 2024, brought a dramatic, almost unimaginable reversal.
Yeah, the numbers are just staggering. We saw industrial electricity rates, especially for the heavy users, those consuming over 300 kilowatts.
Yeah.
They just skyrocketed. The jump was roughly 70 to 76%.
76%. That's not a mild price adjustment. That's a fundamental and immediate cost shock that rewrites a company's entire budget overnight.
It is. And the political decision behind it becomes crystal clear when you compare that 76% surge to the rate increases felt by, residential consumers.
The homeowners.
Exactly. Household rates over the exact same period rose only about 30%.
Yeah.
This creates what we're calling the flip.
Flip.
Yeah. Korea had always practiced intentional cross-subsidization, keeping industrial rates lower than residential rates to fuel that export-led growth. But by 2023, the system formally inverted. Industrial users officially started paying more than households. The entire economic playbook was just tossed out.
And the government made the decision to shield homeowners while essentially making manufacturers the sole paying customer for a massive debt. But let's look at the current numbers manufacturers are dealing with right now. What are the rates based on the most recent data we have?
So if we look at the data from late 2024 and into early 2025, the rate differences are stark. The industrial average rate is hovering around 173,261 per megawatt hour,
Okay.
which translates to approximately 190.41 per kilowatt hour. Now look at the household average rate. It sits at roughly 152,391 per megawatt hour, or about 155.521 per kilowatt hour.
So you're running a factory that generates thousands of jobs, yet you pay a significantly higher unit price for energy than the citizens you employ.
That's it in a nutshell. And we should remember that certain sectors, like agriculture, are still massively shielded, which widens the burden on industry even further, right?
Of course.
Absolutely. Agricultural users are paying a subsidized fraction, around 77,331 per megawatt hour. So the burden is being unevenly distributed onto the back of the largest industrial users.
It's an anomaly.
This inversion makes Korea an absolute global anomaly. In a functional, competitive economy, large-scale industrial users benefit from economies of scale. Even in places like Germany, where rates are high due to green energy taxes, experts rarely see industrial rates exceed 90% of residential rates.
But in Korea.
Yet Korea, by having industrial rates officially surpass household rates, is a huge exception. And it's an exception driven by extreme financial and political pressures.
Which means we have to address the political elephant in the room, as the source material calls it. Critics are labeling this decision-making process electricity bill populism.
That label, it stems from the dire financial straits of the state-owned utility, the Korea Electric Power Corporation, or KPPCO. We have to understand the mechanism behind KPPCO's massive debt.
Right, this didn't happen in a vacuum.
Not at all. KPPCO is structured as a monopoly buyer and retailer. It buys power wholesale based on volatile global fuel costs indexed to oil and LNG, but it's forced to sell power at retail at politically fixed tariffs set by the government.
So when global fuel costs surged after 2021...
They were essentially buying high and selling low, over and over. This led to staggering combined losses of 43 trillion won, which is about $31.2 billion between 2021 and 2023.
That is a colossal fiscal hole. How did the government decide who should pay for that? I mean, what was the logic there?
Well, the government faced a dilemma. Either let KPPCO go bankrupt, which is unthinkable,
right,
or initiate massive broad-based rate hikes across the board, which would spark a public outcry during a period of really high inflation.
So the political solution was to target the least politically volatile sector, the large manufacturers.
That was the calculation. By keeping residential and agricultural increases modest, they protected the livelihood of citizens and avoided that public backlash, the very core of populism.
So the logic was that manufacturers that chaebol their captive consumers, they are less likely to stage street protests, and they are large enough to supposedly absorb the cost.
Precisely. Industrial rates were hiked 7 separate times since 2022 to siphon off KPPCO's losses. This is why manufacturers view these not as economic rates reflecting the true cost of supply, but as political rates designed to maintain government solvency.
And the fear is that this isn't over.
The deep fear is that since KPPCO is still carrying a massive debt load, any future global fuel price volatility will inevitably result in more rate hikes targeted almost exclusively at the manufacturing sector.
Punishing the very engine that creates the wealth and jobs Korea relies on.
It's a dangerous cycle.
That's a perfect transition into the global competitive landscape, because once electricity moves from being a simple, predictable utility expense to becoming a defining input cost, a raw material, as you said, the entire premise of manufacturing in South Korea just collapses.
It absolutely does. This shift is the hinge point driving the entire exodus. We need to stop thinking of electricity simply as power and start recognizing it as the fundamental ingredient in certain heavy industries.
So which sectors are most vulnerable to this change? Where is electricity the defining factor, not just a line item on a spreadsheet?
We're talking about these incredibly energy-intensive processes like copper foil production, where we started the story, but also things like glass melting, the creation of polysilicon for solar panels, and base metal refining. In these specialized processes, electricity is not a marginal expense. It accounts for a critical 30% and often up to 40% of the total production cost.
Think back to SK Nexilis. Producing copper foil sheets 130th, the thickness of a human hair requires constant, stable, 24-hour high-voltage currents. The technology is amazing, but the operation is essentially a massive, high-tech electricity sink.
That is.
So if 30% of your cost structure is suddenly 76% more expensive, how can you possibly compete internationally?
The answer is you can't. The global appeal of Korea as a manufacturing hub rested on skilled labor, unparalleled infrastructure, and cheap, reliable power. When that last variable shifts so dramatically, the country instantly loses ground to every major manufacturing peer globally.
Let's lay out those hard numbers to really grasp the competitive gap. How does Korea stack up against, say, the US and China right now?
The comparison is stark, and it's frankly alarming for Korean industry. The data shows Korea's average industrial rate sitting at about $127.99 per megawatt hour.
Okay, $127.9.
Now contrast that with the United States. Thanks to cheaper natural gas and regional incentives, the U.S. rate is significantly lower at $81.55 per megawatt hour. That means Korean industry is paying a premium of 57% more for power than its direct counterparts in the U.S.
57%.
And China is also notably cheaper, with industrial rates generally in the range of $80 to $90 per megawatt hour.
A 57% cost premium on the single most critical input for heavy industry it's a gap that efficiency and even highly skilled labor cannot possibly bridge.
It guarantees non-competitiveness. Let's translate those figures back into the local rates for a second. Korea is paying about 190.41 per kilowatt hour.
Right.
The U.S. averages around 121.51, and China is roughly 129.41. Industry analysts are now saying explicitly that Korea's electricity is no longer cheap when compared with other manufacturing-heavy competitors.
Which makes the strategy for corporate planners chillingly simple.
It does. If energy is 40% of my cost, and I can move production to a location where that cost is halved, I have to move. It's not for profit, it's for sheer survival.
And here is where the theory turns into hard reality. We are witnessing this survival migration in real time, with monumental decisions being made by massive conglomerates.
These case studies perfectly illustrate the immediate consequence of this inverted tariff structure. Companies are not waiting. They are actively seeking out low-cost energy zones worldwide.
Let's go back to SK Nexilis again. They are moving equipment from Jeonjup to Central Asia.
Yes, the heavy machinery is being relocated to Uzbekistan. Their internal analysis showed the power cost in Jeonjup was just unsustainable, making the domestic factory economically impossible to run at full capacity.
Because power accounts for over 30% of the product cost.
Right. So the strategic long-term shift is to transform the remaining domestic facility into an R&D-focused mother factory. This keeps the high-value intellectual property, the design, and the engineering knowledge in Korea, but exports the massive energy-hungry physical production to cheaper jurisdictions.
And this exodus is happening across the entire heavy industrial base. Korea Zinc, a refining giant, is making a massive pivot toward the United States.
Refining is another hypo-energy-intensive sector. Korea Zinc made the strategic decision to build a monumental integrated refinery complex in Tennessee in the U.S.
And this was largely about energy costs.
It was largely dictated by energy costs.
Yeah.
In Korea, they're paying around 181 per kilowatt hour. In parts of Tennessee, ultra-large industrial consumers can secure favorable, stable rates as low as 60 to 71 per kilowatt hour.
That's less than half.
It's cutting their single largest operating cost by more than half. The company is committing $11 trillion, that's over $8.4 billion to this U.S. investment. That move clearly signals that future production priority will be shifted away from higher-cost Korean operations.
And the steel sector, the traditional backbone of the Korean industrial miracle, is doing the same. Hyundai Steel and POSCO, two giants, are heavily investing in the U.S.
We see both of them participating in a massive $5.8 billion investment into an electric arc furnace steel mill in Louisiana. Louisiana's industrial electricity rates are highly favorable, roughly half the current Korean rate, sitting at about $51.10 per megawatt hour. Now, while there are certainly market factors and U.S. tariff incentives influencing these moves.
Sure, like the IRA.
Right, but the soaring cost of domestic power is the fundamental push factor, forcing them to localize production in North America.
The story of OCI Holdings, which deals in polysilicon, is particularly chilling because electricity accounts for 40% of their costs.
Polysilicon is often cited as the ultimate example of an energy-defined industry. Facing that cost surge in Korea, OCI acquired a factory in Malaysia.
And the price difference?
Staggering. The electricity price in Malaysia is roughly 1/3 of the current Korean price. And critically, OCI secured a 10-year direct purchase power contract there.
So they have predictability.
It guarantees them cost stability and predictability, something they absolutely cannot get in Korea under the rigid KIPICO retail monopoly. This is about securing the strategic material supply chain outside of the national borders.
Even industries like glass manufacturing, which you don't typically associate with high-tech semiconductors, are being forced out.
KCC glass is a classic example. Melting raw sand to create flat glass requires enormous sustained heat. It's a high-energy furnace process.
Right.
So even though the company saw an 8% drop in production over 2 years, its electricity bill jumped by 56%, reaching 69.3 billion won.
So production is down, but the bill is way up.
Exactly. Their immediate practical solution was to move idle domestic equipment from their Yeoju factory to Indonesia, where local power costs are also about 1/3 of Korea's. They are explicitly planning future new factory builds in Southeast Asia and Oceania, demonstrating a clear strategic abandonment of Korea as a primary manufacturing base for these intensive materials.
It paints a picture of systemic industrial hollowing out, and this immense financial burden is also hitting the high-tech giants, like Samsung and SK Hynix, who are perhaps too deeply entrenched to fully relocate.
Exactly. The semiconductor, display, and petrochemical sectors face the largest overall financial cost burden, even if they aren't fully relocating their main operations.
They can't just move a semiconductor fab.
No, but these industries are extremely power-intensive, and due to the high specialization and complexity of their fabrication processes, they find it nearly impossible to substitute energy sources or suddenly become significantly more efficient. The impact of the rate hikes is magnified for them.
It's hard to visualize that financial strain. Can we put a number on the sheer scale of the annual electricity payments for these giants?
We can. Based on recent corporate audit data, Samsung Electronics, one of the world's largest companies, pays an estimated 3 trillion won, about $2.3 billion annually for electricity alone.
3 trillion won.
And SK Hynix pays just over 1 trillion won annually. When the base cost of that power supply increases by 76% in 3 years, it is an enormous headwind.
So while they won't move the fabrication plants, the fabs, their cost structures are fundamentally undermined.
It makes it harder to invest domestically and maintain global pricing competitiveness against rivals in the US and China.
So we have this rapid outward flow of major conglomerates, but this leads us to the critical ripple effect. The hollowing out of the industrial ecosystem, starting with the small and mid-sized enterprises, or SMEs.
This is the real tragedy unfolding. The chaebol have the resources and logistics teams to execute a survival migration to Tennessee or Uzbekistan. SMEs, the thousands of firms that feed the supply chain, have almost no such recourse. They are locked in.
They are trapped by their geography. Their entire business model is built around proximity, providing specialized foundry services, mold making, surface treatment, or precision parts to the anchor tenants.
Right, and if the anchor tenants move,
the SMEs are left supplying empty facilities.
Correct. These SMEs are the unsung, essential internal organs of the Korean manufacturing body. But they are now facing a true existential crisis caused by power costs. We heard anecdotal evidence from a veteran in the foundry business who said that in nearly 60 years in the industry, he had never seen the cost situation this bad due to electricity prices.
60 years.
His firm, with a monthly revenue of 3 billion won, about $2.3 million, sees over 500 million won, or 1/6 of its entire income, vanish instantly into the electricity bill. And that cost is only expected to climb, especially with seasonal summer pricing.
If 1/6 of your revenue goes to a single uncontrollable cost, your margin for error, for investment, for growth, it just vanishes instantly. We are seeing businesses physically close their doors, aren't we?
Yes. Look at the surface treatment industry, a necessary step for everything from cars to consumer electronics. Samul Metal reported electricity accounts for over 20% of their total production cost.
20%.
The head of the Korea Surface Finishing Master Group noted that their rates have more than doubled, jumping from about 100 won to 210 won per kilowatt hour.
And the key problem here is leverage, right? These small firms often operate on long-term supply contracts with the large cable.
They lack the negotiating power to immediately pass on a 100% utility cost increase.
They can't adjust their pricing, but their input costs have doubled.
It creates an immediate liquidity crisis. In the Banmul Industrial Complex, which is a major manufacturing cluster, 10 out of 35 surface treatment firms have been forced out of business in just the last 2 years.
That is nearly 1/3 of a critical supply chain segment vanishing.
It is. When you lose the ability to perform foundational manufacturing processes domestically, it sends up a huge warning flare about national supply chain sovereignty.
That is the ultimate consequence. Experts are warning that this mass departure risks the viability of the entire industrial base.
It does. Losing heady industries, the capacity to make your own glass, your own steel, your own foundational chemicals, means losing the core industrial competence that supports the high-tech, high-value sectors.
If the fundamental inputs leave.
The country loses its ability to internally manage and adapt its manufacturing body. The traditional competitive advantage built up over decades, the infrastructure, the clustered expertise, is nullified when the power cost is simply economically irrational compared to rivals.
And then there's that fascinating second-order systemic effect you mentioned, the risk this exodus poses to the stability of the entire power grid structure.
This is a crucial, often overlooked layer of complexity. The state electric grid, run by Kanto, is designed and operated based on massive economies of scale.
Okay.
The presence of ultra-large anchor tenants, the Samsungs, the SK Hynixes, the POSCos, guarantees consistent high-volume demand. This stability and volume are essential for maintaining a low-cost, stable supply for everyone else, including residential users.
So, if the largest, most profitable consumers systematically leave the grid, either by relocating or by finding alternative power procurement methods, the math for Capico and the remaining consumers changes dramatically.
Exactly. The infrastructure costs, the immense cost of maintaining the transmission lines, the substations, the generation capacity are essentially fixed costs.
Right.
If those fixed costs suddenly need to be distributed over a smaller pool of remaining users, everyone else, particularly the remaining SMEs and eventually residential users down the road, will inevitably face higher, more volatile, and less stable prices in the future.
So the short-term political fix of freezing household bills today could very well destabilize the entire long-term power system tomorrow.
That is the risk.
It makes you wonder how Korea arrived at this political and economic quicksand. This isn't just a sudden accident, it's the consequence of decades of industrial policy and critically incomplete reforms.
We have to trace this back to the legacy of Capeco, the state monopoly created in 1961. Capeco is intentionally designed as an instrument of national economic development.
Capico's core mandate was to supply sufficient low-cost power to facilitate the rapid industrialization, the miracle on the Han River.
And to achieve that, the system relied on a deliberate, long-standing mechanism: cross-subsidization. Residential and commercial consumers historically paid higher tariffs, essentially a surcharge, which was used to subsidize the much lower rates for industrial and agricultural users.
Which protected the manufacturing sector and kept Korean exports cheap globally.
It did. But this legacy of cheap, subsidized power created a deep structural problem over time. It essentially made the Korean industrial sector addicted to cheap energy, discouraging efficiency.
That is the key long-term consequence. Because power was artificially subsidized, the industrial base developed a structure that consumed too much power compared to its economic output.
I mean, if you look at the data, Korea's per capita power consumption approached that of Japan, even though Korea's per capita income was only half of Japan's.
Wow. So the financial incentive to conserve, to innovate energy-efficient processes, or to invest heavily in self-generation was severely reduced by the promise of continuous low prices.
Exactly. And attempts were made to fix this structure early in the 21st century, but those efforts stalled out.
What happened? Why did they stall?
Restructuring began in earnest in 2001. The government separated the generation companies from KPICO and established the Korea Power Exchange, or KPX. You can think of the KPX as the wholesale marketplace where generators sell power.
Okay, so that was the first step.
It was. The original plan was a three-stage liberalization, culminating in a fully competitive retail market by 2009. But the process was abruptly halted in 2003.
Why did it stall out just 2 years in? What was the pushback?
Primarily due to political skepticism and fierce union opposition. The powerful union staged major strikes against the privatization efforts, particularly the plan to divest KPO's distribution sector, which would have created competing local retail companies.
And the government backed down.
The administration at the time signaled deep reservations about privatizing what they considered essential network utility industries, leading to the process being permanently frozen.
So the system was left in this strange, incomplete hybrid state for 2 decades. Can you give us an analogy for that partial reform?
Imagine you decide to bake a complex cake. You've mixed all the ingredients perfectly, you've separated them into the individual cake pans, but then you freeze the entire process before you turn on the oven. That's what happened in 2003. They created the separate generators and the wholesale marketplace, the KPX, but the final, critical step letting new retailers compete to sell power to customers was frozen. KPICO remained the main buyer and the only retailer, stuck operating the fixed retail tariff system.
And when global fuel costs surged, KPICO was locked into that terrible pricing scenario, buying high in the KPX marketplace but forced to sell retail at a politically acceptable price, creating that massive debt.
Exactly. Instead of liberalizing retail rates and letting the market absorb the true cost, the government had to adopt these distortionary measures, like dual wholesale pricing, to try and manage KPCO's losses.
But this crisis has unexpectedly revived a dormant 20-year-old legal provision, the Direct Purchase Power Agreement, or DPA.
Right. Suddenly, necessity has breathed new life into an unused law.
What is the DPA and why did no one use it until now?
The DPA is a system that legally allows large customers to buy power directly from the KPX, the wholesale exchange, effectively bypassing the KPO retail structure. It's been on the books since 2003, but it was completely dormant for years.
Why?
Because KPO's subsidized rates were simply too low to make the effort and complexity of setting up a direct purchase worthwhile. It was cheaper to just stick with KPO.
But now that KPCO's mandated rates have skyrocketed, that bypassing mechanism looks like the only exit sign.
The cost hikes have fundamentally altered the economics. Now, companies like SK Advanced and LG Chem are actively opting for direct power purchases. Even state-owned enterprises are exploring this. The Korea Railroad Corporation, which spends nearly $580 billion annually, about $420 million on electricity, is investigating DPA. We are even seeing smaller firms that are currently below the required 30,000 kilovolt ampere threshold for direct purchases, inquiring about upgrading their internal systems just to be able to legally bypass KPSO.
That speaks volumes about the desperation to escape the current political rate structure.
It does. It's a fascinating paradox. The political failure to complete market reforms 2 decades ago is now being unintentionally undone by the sheer force of financial necessity. The market is forcing the use of the dormant liberalization tools.
A market correction driven by economic pain.
Exactly. The competitive structure has become such a massive liability that companies are dusting off mechanisms designed for a liberalized system that never fully materialized.
Let's broaden our scope again and look at where these companies are going. This exodus isn't purely about finding cheap power. It's part of a much larger global geopolitical pivot away from traditional reliance on certain regions.
That's a critical point. The strategic relocation of Korean industry to Southeast Asia and Central Asia is deeply layered with geopolitical considerations, specifically the imperative to de-risk supply chains and reduce reliance on China.
Vietnam is clearly a prime destination for Korean foreign direct investment. Beyond just cheap power and labor, what makes Vietnam so strategically attractive right now?
Vietnam offers a powerful confluence of advantages. You have the predictable low labor costs and highly favorable geographical advantages for shipping. Crucially, however, the perception of intellectual property risk in Vietnam is significantly lower compared to China.
That's a huge factor.
It is. Furthermore, Korean national policy is actively encouraging this shift. Following previous economic sanctions and retaliation from China due to geopolitical tensions, like the TA missile defense radar incident, Korea initiated the Shin-Nam-bang policy, or the New Southern Policy.
So the New Southern Policy is essentially a political and economic push to harden ties and increase investment specifically in South Asian countries.
Exactly. Companies are achieving 2 major goals simultaneously. They are escaping debilitating domestic power costs, and they are strategically diversifying their supply chains away from China-centric risk.
And this shift is already underway in a big way.
It's immense. South Korea is Vietnam's largest foreign investor, with accumulated registered capital nearing $72 billion across over 9,000 projects, driven by anchor tenants like Samsung and LG, who've already established massive infrastructure there. This existing base makes it logistically easier for secondary and tertiary suppliers to follow suit.
Looking forward, if South Korea wants to halt this high-voltage bleeding, structural reform seems absolutely unavoidable. What are the key solutions that energy experts are putting on the table to restore industrial competitiveness?
Experts are unanimous. The next administration must move beyond these temporary political rates and fundamentally reform the energy pricing system to make it sustainable. There are several specific, actionable structural reforms being proposed.
What's the most immediate measure that could offer a lifeline, especially to those struggling SMEs?
One of the most rational and potentially fastest solutions is the expansion of decentralized energy trading zones. This would allow local businesses to legally bypass Kyoto entirely and buy power directly from a generator, perhaps saving them 20 to 30% on their bills.
And for SMEs whose profitability is currently being wiped out by electricity costs?
That 20% saving is the difference between survival and bankruptcy.
And how do we fix the bizarre inversion in pricing that penalizes the very industrial users who create wealth?
That requires moving toward a truly nuanced pricing structure. The current system is too blunt. It categorizes rates simply by usage type: industrial, residential, agricultural. A far fairer, more efficient system would segment rates by region and voltage level.
Explain that a bit more.
The fundamental principle of power transmission is that electricity is significantly cheaper to supply at higher voltages because there are fewer losses in the system. Large industrial users who consume power at extremely high voltages should receive a rate that accurately reflects the lower cost of supplying them,
rather than being forced to subsidize the distribution losses associated with lower voltage residential and commercial users.
That makes perfect economic sense. It prices the service based on the actual cost of delivery, not on a political category.
Precisely. Furthermore, we have to address the cost driver that often gets overlooked: carbon targets.
Right, the climate goals.
Korea's ambitious 2035 Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC, is intrinsically raising the cost pressure on electricity. The government significantly increased the paid allocation ratio of carbon emission permits in the power generation sector, moving from 10% to 50% by 2030.
So the power generators have to pay dramatically more for the right to emit carbon, and that cost has to be passed somewhere, in this case, into the wholesale price of electricity.
Correct. It creates a structural reality where power generation unit costs, and thus electricity rates, must naturally increase to account for the true environmental cost. Any discussion about lowering prices dramatically must first reconcile with the country's mandatory climate change goals.
Ultimately, it seems the deepest solution involves finally completing the market reforms that were stalled 20 years ago.
That's the long-term consensus. Despite the political failure to achieve full market competition, the partial restructuring we saw in 2001, the divestiture of the generation companies, did yield documented efficiency gains.
Like what?
Things like improved heat efficiency in power plants and reduced planned outage days. The challenge now is to finish the job by introducing true retail competition.
How would introducing competition stabilize the market, especially given the current volatility?
New ideas, often modeled after markets like Texas or Australia, are being proposed. One key proposal is allowing generation companies to actually enter the retail business.
So they generate and sell directly.
Exactly. This allows the generator/retailer to offer customers a physical hedge against wholesale price fluctuations. Instead of Capiso buying all the expensive power wholesale and passing on the volatility via a fixed tariff, competing retailers can manage their own risk and offer more stable, competitive rates to large industrial users.
Finally introducing the competition the market has been lacking for decades.
So what does this entire deep dive mean for you, the listener, and the future shape of the Korean economy?
What we have seen is a profound conflict. The well-meaning short-term policy goal of protecting household budgets from price shocks has had the unavoidable consequence of causing the swift and systematic erosion of industrial competitiveness.
Right.
Strategically important, energy-intensive sectors, the very foundations of the economy, have been forced to leave, confirming the hard truth that when industrial power becomes unaffordable relative to global competitors, the decision to manufacture domestically becomes economically illogical.
It highlights the massive invisible cost of electricity bill populism.
And the final consequence confirms a sobering reality for a manufacturing-based economy.
If the foundation of the country's modern economic structure, the steel, the chemicals, the basic material processing, is systematically exported to places with cheaper power, the long-term cost to the Miracle on the Han River far outweighs the short-term benefit of frozen residential bills.
The provocative thought here isn't just, where will the jobs go, but how long until the loss of the foundational heavy industry forces high-tech giants who can no longer find critical domestic suppliers or benefit from economies of scale to follow suit entirely?
A sobering, high-voltage look at the cost of stability.